The following program is made possible by Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Throughout the Bay Area, everyone, residents, would-be residents, employers, and leading elected officials are crying out for a solution to the regional housing shortage. And many of them have decided Brisbane is standing in the way. The game is housing, the game is on. I'm Mark Simon. Welcome to the game. It may be the sole remaining large parcel of Bay Area land available for housing. 600 acres of landfill and an old rail yard in Brisbane. For more than a decade, the city has wrestled with what to do with this plot of land. Contaminated, but vacant. Now there is regional pressure to build housing there, and not just a little. Enough to triple the population of a city that has long been described as tiny and sleepy. Last month, the City Council voted 5-0 to begin the process of putting on the November ballot an amendment to the city's general plan that would allow for the building of up to 2,200 housing units, double the number that currently exists in San Bruno, and up to 4 million square feet of commercial development. Citywide polling from 2015 shows that Brisbane voters feel mixed at best about the proposal, but state legislators and regional news outlets have been sharply critical of the Brisbane City Council for not considering a plan that called for 4,000 housing units. Here to talk about this complicated and pressure-packed issue are Clark Conway, Mayor of Brisbane, and City Manager Clay Holstein. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Tough issue. I think an awful lot of the voices telling you what to do with your land in Brisbane may have drowned out some of the voices from Brisbane. So give us sort of your overview of this piece of property. It's a Baylands piece of property adjacent to the bay, long contaminated, seriously contaminated. Give us an overview, Mayor Conway.
Okay, yeah. Well, it was purchased in 1989 by the current corporation, Tuntex Corporation, who now has a subsidiary called Universal Paragon. And it was a former rail yard and a landfill, the municipal landfill, where San Francisco used to dump their garbage from 1932, I think, to 1967. And the rail yard was seriously contaminated with a lot of solvents and oils and things like that. In the landfill portion, there was unrestricted dumping. And Tuntex Corporation bought this, and they bought it knowing that they had to do the cleanup also. In the 29 plus years that they've owned it, they haven't done anything. And I think in 1989, the Department of Toxic Substance Control also issued a cleanup order on the rail yard site. And the landfill site has yet to be capped. So it's a Title 27 is what it's called, and they have to put an impermeable barrier over it, and that hasn't happened yet either. So,
well, putting aside the question of how many housing units there should or shouldn't be there, Clay, how much has the issue of cleaning up this contamination slowed down the process of making a decision about what to do there?
Well, I think, as the mayor has indicated, this has been a long-standing issue with the property owner, and there's been a real desire, I think, on the community's part, and not just residents of Brisbane, but also residents in nearby San Francisco and Visitation Valley, that this area gets cleaned up to a standard in which a true residential neighborhood could exist. To that end, the council is going to consider general plan language that would require a cleanup standard that would allow for parks, would allow for daycares, would allow for schools, would allow for all the kinds of things that need to be incorporated into a residential development. That is not true with the development on the other side of the border in San Francisco, where all those things are restricted to the Schleglock project. And we want a different standard, because this is going to be a community that's roughly equal to the size of our current community. And so we want it to be a full-fledged place where people can live and have opportunity to do all the things.
City services, community services, schools,
Correct.
It works.
Right.
Yeah. There is a lot of concern among your residents, among your constituents about this contamination. The poll I referenced, the 2015 poll, 86% said their number one priority is remediating the contaminated property. 89% are worried about the air quality. Another 88% are worried about the water quality of your town. So this is Is that essentially what has to happen before anything else can happen there, Clark?
Absolutely. And it has to be safe, and it has to be cleaned up to those standards that Clay was just talking about. And those standards, are going to be driven by what DTSC finds out there. They have to do the analysis and come up with the remedial action plan for it, and then we want to go through it with our consultants too, and make sure that we have a seat at the table, that this is absolutely clean and safe for people. The last thing that we want is something happening where people have the potential of getting sick because it's not cleaned up properly.
Yeah. Any idea how much this would cost? I mean, is there even a ballpark figure right now for what it would take to get this land to the point where it could be good for residential and for parks and for all the other uses you're envisioning?
Well, the site is fairly complex, as you indicated. I mean, there's really 3 different distinct locations on this site, and the site we're talking about for the housing is in the northern piece of it. I'm not really sure what the cleanup costs are going to be for that site. I know for the entire site cleanup, which includes the old landfill where more commercial types of businesses might take place, was a price tag of well over $100 million. So between the cleanup costs and some of the what the construction people would call the horizontal costs, the streets, the water, and the sewer, you have a huge price tag for this entire project of well over $1 billion. And so that's one of the challenges for the developer.
Is that cleanup and construction?
And construction, right.
Okay, yeah.
Right. And that's just getting you to the point that where you could actually start building buildings. So it's a very expensive project, and it's one that's going to take place over many decades, frankly. We would anticipate a good 20 to 30 year build out for the entire project. Now the housing piece is a piece that I think could come a little bit sooner in that process, but again, only if the cleanup is done to a manner that is satisfactory to the community.
Universal Paragon's general manager was quoted in one of the news articles about calling it a textbook example of a case in which the state needs to step in and do something about what's broken that allows communities to spend 12 years considering a proposal. That sounds a little disingenuous to me. And it sounds like what it sounds like is that they're looking for someone else to pick up the tab for this contamination cleanup. What's your take of that?
Probably.
Yeah?
I mean, they probably are. I mean, it's like I said, they have done nothing for 29 years. When, if they had started back in 1989, this wouldn't even be an issue. But they did nothing, and that was a choice. And, as things go, the cost rises. And so now, they have a lot of money tied up into this right now. But they paid $100 million for the land in 1989, but they haven't done much with it other than they had a dirt recycling operation out there.
Yeah. So you put a measure on the ballot that includes requiring the cleanup. Does this move anything along faster? It sounds like these issues, it sounds like a lot of, I'm asking too long a question and we're coming up on a break, so let's do that first. We're going to take a quick break and we'll get to the more complicated questions. You stick around. I know you can't wait for the complicated answers.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. We're joined by Clay Holstein, the city manager of Brisbane, and Clark Conway, the current mayor of Brisbane, and we're talking about the proposal to build anywhere from 1,000 to 2,200 housing units and 4 million square feet of commercial space on 600 acres called the Baylands. It's been a project of some controversy. We're going to get into this. We've been talking about the contaminated area and how much the cleanup's going to cost. Clay, first of all, let's walk through the nuts and bolts of, the council has asked to put something on the ballot in November. That was the 5-0 vote we referenced earlier in the show. What happens next, and what's the process, and what do you think that ballot measure is going to look like?
So the next step is for the council actually to adopt language that would implement a general plan amendment to send to the voters, and we anticipate that will happen in May or June of this year, so a fairly short period of time.
The current general plan actually doesn't allow housing to be built out there.
Correct. The general plan
So it has to be amended.
Right. And the council has for well over a decade committed to the community that they would refer this to the voters to vote on. So that's keeping that promise. So once that takes place, then we will also go through a process of certifying the draft environmental document that supports a development out there and kind of sets that in stage. And then assuming that gets all approved by the voters in November, then the next stage in this process is for a specific plan to be submitted to the city by the developer that is in conformance with the new general plan, which the general plan will read that we have anywhere between 18 to 2,200 housing units. It will give a geographical location for that, which is basically in the northwest corner of the site. And it will have some other things like requirements for water to be provided and some of the transportation and sustainability things that have come up through the process of review that the council has wanted to have in there. So this really sets the stage, and it's kind of the requisite. It's kind of the key things that as a city we do is that we plan for our communities and plan for the land uses, and it will send a message to the developer that this is the parameters of a development that we are going to approve.
So does this break the deadlock? You've got Universal Paragon saying that, the state really needs to step in and make this happen. You guys have been saying in other contexts that Universal Paragon hasn't really aggressively addressed this the way it should. Does this change?
It gives them more certainty from our perspective, that now we've established a land use and now it's time for you to move forward, but you got to do the cleanup first.
And the standards for doing that are still set by the state.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're just setting the outcomes that we want to see in terms of the types of uses that we want to see out there, and then however the state sees best to regulate that and to oversee that, the actual cleanup. We'll work with that, but we just want to see certain outcomes.
So in essence, the general plan amendment will say, a cleanup pursuant to state standards, and then the state will certify whether or not they've done that?
Right, and what the general plan will actually say is a residential cleanup, and it will allow for all these types of uses.
Which has a certain standard that...
Right.
It's a higher degree.
Yeah.
It's the highest degree standard.
Well, because, I referenced the polling before. People are worried about what happens to you if you go out there. And I know from watching some of the hearings that you've had, they're still worried about it. They're not necessarily, some people are not necessarily comfortable that this is going to be cleaned up and not end up affecting the air, or I think there's a greater concern probably about groundwater and how this might affect that.
There's concern about if the state can make those standards happen.
Uh-huh.
And I think it comes down to a trust issue. Can the state really perform to make these standards happen? I know that two of the areas there were designated Superfund sites when they had bought it, and that was withdrawn when UPC bought it, or Tuntex, and that was withdrawn, the Superfund designation, because I guess there wasn't enough residential within the vicinity at the time. So,
well, the Superfund sites are great. I remember visiting one years ago, traveling with a presidential candidate, and afterwards somebody from the site said we had to get rid of our shoes. So it's a whole different level.
Yeah.
The council voted 5-0, but there's been a lot of there's been a lot of regional pressure, and we'll get into that in the next segment. But is this going to pass? There are a lot of people in your city. If you go on some of the polling I've seen from your town, there are a lot of other things they'd rather be done with that than build more housing. And there's a lot of people who don't want to lose that sort of small town feel that Brisbane has, that it almost prides itself on.
Yeah, we're confident that it's going to pass, because the alternatives to it not passing could be much worse.
Like what?
Like the state stepping in, or you being subject to some of the state laws that come down that haven't been implemented yet, such as SB 827. We don't know what that's going to look like, but there is concern of it. And if this doesn't pass, then we're going to be subject to a whole lot of other stuff that, potentially bad law.
Yeah. A lot of people in a lot of cities on the peninsula don't want to lose whatever the character is of their town. But this is not something that's just a passing fancy in Brisbane. There's a real sensibility in Brisbane of what kind of community it is, the way it's laid out, the way it looks, the kinds of things that happen there. Isn't that the case, Clay?
Well, sure, and I think that more than character, it's just the kind of the culture of the town and the ethos of the town, if you want to look at it that way. But we've incorporated new residents, new residential areas into our town in the recent past. We had a 500-unit project at the Northeast Ridge, which was about a third of our population within the last 20 years. It hasn't really changed the culture of the town. It's people who moved there kind of think and see things are pretty much similar to the people who live in the central part of town. So I think we're confident that this development can take place, and Brisbane will continue to be the unique place that it is, and we can build upon that culture. So that's obviously a concern. That change is always a concern to people, but we're confident that we can do that.
Is change inevitable, though, given what's happening in the Bay Area and on the peninsula?
Well, I think that's the message that we've received from Sacramento, from our state senator, Jerry Hill, who's actually been extremely helpful in this process. I mean, we would not be where we're at today without his assistance. But things are changing. This is not the Bay Area that you and I and Clark grew up in. It's changed dramatically, and certainly in the last 20 years has changed significantly. And so, we need to be a party to that, and I think the council is ready to do that. I can tell you that in my almost 40 years in public service, I've never seen a city council more united to do something because they think it's in the best interest of the community. It's been incredibly impressive the way the council has worked together, and I think one of the reasons that the mayor is saying that he's sure that this is going to pass is because the council is very united behind this being the right decision for the community.
And councils do reflect their towns. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Stick around.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. I'm Mark Simon. We're joined by Clay Holstein, the city manager of Brisbane, and Clark Conway, the mayor of Brisbane, talking about the 600-acre Baylands project and what it's going to mean. We've talked about the November ballot, but there was a huge amount of regional pressure on Brisbane to do this and more. The Chronicle editorial, the Bay Area's housing crisis, is on full display in the tiny city of Brisbane. They use the phrase local obstructionism at the heart of the issue. Scott Wiener, the state senator, called you guys out. Essentially, it looks as though the bill he introduced to require more housing may have been specifically prompted by what's going on in Brisbane. How did you feel about that?
Victimized, because the city council hadn't even started its deliberations. We were just starting the hearings, and I think what they predicated their decisions on or ideas was that Brisbane's planning commission had approved 2.5 million square feet out there of commercial only, and that prompted them to take some action on it, but the council itself hadn't even deliberated on it. And so we were kind of really victimized in a sense from the newspapers and also from the San Francisco politicians in Sacramento. And the landscape in Sacramento has changed in the last year and a half. It's changed dramatically. And with the housing being at the forefront, that all these bills, housing bills that are being rammed through right now, it's just changing the whole landscape of California, how business is going to be done. And I think that cities are being restricted on their local land use. Some of these bills are going to make it a lot tougher for cities to be able to have the local control.
Well, and you go back far enough, Prop 13 took away the city's taxing authority. So really, it seemed to me that the only real power cities have now is in land use. And now that's being threatened. How important is land use authority to a city, Clay?
Well, I think that this is obviously a very complicated issue in terms of local control, and at a local level we throw out that term quite a bit. But I think what we're trying to really respond to is the concerns that our community brings forward. And you indicated some numbers from polling that show that our community has been very engaged in this project, and people really understand this site. So when the state or people from outside Brisbane come along and say, well, you ought to do this, you ought to do that, people in the community say, well, wait a minute, there's more to this story. Yeah. And I think that's what has really driven a lot of the local concern. But I think, you know, we're at a point now where the threat from Sacramento that was presented to us last year, we've worked that issue through with our state senator, Jerry Hill. He is very much supportive of where we're at this point, and he's been a very significant ally for us in this process. Mm-hmm. So the council really wants to take the initiative, get out in front of this, set some standards for the cleanup and for the economics of the project so that it can work for our community. We've never been against housing. We've never been against development. We just want it to be done right. Mm-hmm. And that's the issue that the council is putting forward, and I think that is the relationship, frankly, that we have with Senator Hill, and who is very supportive of those goals.
Yeah. You were talking about how the attitude has changed. I know at one of the council meetings you talked about, you used a different term, but I think that what we say is that it's become almost obsessive about housing. And just a few years ago, it was building more office space.
That was in the end of the 90s and 2000s that we don't have enough office space. I mean, Clay and I were around then, and, you know, we had businesses come to us, we need to build a second story, you know, and then pretty soon that dot-com bubble burst, and, you know, we had the building in South San Francisco that was just built, and it sat vacant for almost 10 years. And now they're just building the second tower. But that happened, you know, where, you know, it may happen with housing, because right now, from what I understand, we got more people leaving California than what we have coming in here. So I don't know how that's going to balance out. And I believe that we're also closer to the next recession than we are further away from the last one. So.
What is Brisbane's responsibility to solve the region's housing problem? What's your role? A lot of cities defer it. A lot of cities say they can't do it. If there wasn't this vacant land, I'm not sure what else you would be doing. I guess one of the questions I'm asking, Clay, is, all things being equal, would Brisbane have rather not built anything there? Or was there always going to be something, and the 13 years was a series of factors that complicated the matter?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of complicating issues over the years, and certainly, you know, the developer and the city could look and point fingers at each other, but it's a complicated site, and I think everybody understands that. It's also a site that is going to be developed in some fashion, and I think everybody understands that, and everybody's understood that over the years. We can have great differences of opinion about what that ought to be, but even what came out of our planning commission last year was a development of some sort. People could argue about it, but it was not just leave the area vacant and don't do anything with it. I think there's always been an understanding that to get the cleanup of the site that everybody wants, there has to be a development. Yeah,
so Clark, let me ask that question to you then. What is Brisbane's responsibility to the region?
Well, we certainly would do our part, but we're a small town. You know, we're not responsible for everything that happens in the Bay Area, of course, you know, but we would do our part of what we're, you know, for housing and stuff like that. And our residents understand that, you know, that we do our part. We just, you know, rezoned 230 units, which is, you know, a good portion, more than 15% of our housing stock. And we just did that recently, and then approved, 16 units of senior housing, you know. So, I mean, we've been doing our part, and we do it methodically, not like, you know, massively. So, you know, I think Brisbane's always done its responsible portion of whatever needed to be done.
We've only got 30 seconds left, so hopefully we can get a quick question, a quick answer. How different is Brisbane going to be when this is all done?
I don't know. It's not going to be a whole lot different, other than the fact that the Baylands community is going to be physically separated from the central part of town, and, you know, how that ties in together, we don't really know. That's going to be a challenge. So.
Clay Holstein, City Manager of Brisbane, Clark Conway, Mayor of Brisbane, thank you for being on The Game. And thank you for watching. Join us next time on The Game.